The convoy rolled through the pine forests of East Texas in the autumn dusk of 1944, headlights cutting narrow paths through the settling darkness. Private First Class Isaiah Caldwell sat rigid in the back of the ambulance, his medical bag wedged between his knees, the worn leather warm from his grip. The November air carried the scent of pine sap and red clay, familiar smells that reminded him of Georgia, though he tried not to think about home. Home meant his mother's kitchen, Sunday services at the Baptist church, and the crisp white apron she wore when she worked as a nurse's aide at the colored clinic in Macon. Home meant the life he'd left behind when the draft notice came in the winter of 1942. The ambulance hit a rut, and Isaiah's shoulder pressed against Corporal James Turner, who sat beside him with his arms crossed, jaw set in that familiar expression of controlled anger. They were heading to Camp Swift, about 30 miles east of Austin, where a POW camp housed German soldiers captured in North Africa and France. Isaiah had been at Fort Sam Houston for 3 months now, assigned to the 687th Ambulance Company, an all-black medical unit that had been shuttled between various duties no white unit wanted. They'd cleaned latrines, hauled supplies, dug drainage ditches, and occasionally, when the white medical officers deemed it necessary, they were allowed to practice the medicine they'd been trained to provide. "They're sending us to patch up Nazis," Turner muttered, his voice low enough that Sergeant Hayes, sitting up front with the driver, wouldn't hear. "Won't let us near white Gias with paper cuts, but we're good enough for Hitler's boys." Isaiah didn't respond. He'd learned that silence was often the safest response to truth that cut too deep. He adjusted his medical bag, checking the contents for the 100th time since they'd left Fort Sam. Sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, bandages, surgical tape, tourniquets. The tools of his trade learned in a cramped classroom at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, where he and 60 other black men had trained under white instructors, who alternated between condescension and outright hostility. He'd studied battlefield medicine, the treatment of wounds, the stabilization of trauma patients, the signs of shock and infection. He dreamed of saving lives, of proving himself, of honoring his mother's dedication to healing. Hadn't dreamed of this. The convoy passed through the gates of Camp Swift just after nightfall. The POW compound sat on the eastern edge of the base, a sprawling complex of whitewashed barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing and guard towers. Floodlights mounted on poles cast harsh white light across the compound, creating stark shadows that made the place look more like a film set than a prison camp. Isaiah could see groups of men in faded German uniforms moving between buildings, some carrying what looked like sports equipment, others smoking cigarettes near the barrack steps. The ambulance pulled up to a single-story building marked with a red cross, and Sergeant Hayes climbed out, his boots hitting the gravel with military precision. "Caldwell, Turner with me," he said. "The rest of you set up the medical station. We've got incoming wounded from a work detail accident inside." The camp hospital was cleaner than any facility Isaiah had seen since joining the Army. White painted walls, proper examination tables, cabinets stocked with supplies. A white officer, a captain with a medical caduceus on his collar, looked up from a desk where he'd been writing in a logbook. His eyes moved over Isaiah and Turner with the casual dismissal of someone evaluating furniture. "These the colored medics from Fort Sam?" he asked Sergeant Hayes, not addressing Isaiah or Turner directly. "Yes, sir, Private Caldwell and Corporal Turner. Best medical men in the company." The captain made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. "We've got 6 prisoners coming in. Work detail at the sawmill. Conveyor belt malfunction. Multiple lacerations, possible fractures, one severe crushing injury to the hand and forearm." He finally looked at Isaiah. "You know how to handle traumatic amputations?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah said, his voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "I've studied the procedure and assisted with similar cases during training." "Well, you're about to get practical experience," the captain said. "The German medical orderly who usually handles their care is down with pneumonia. We've got a camp physician, Dr. Schmidt, one of the prisoners, but he doesn't have proper equipment or supplies. You'll be working with him." The captain paused, his expression suggesting he was about to deliver a punchline to a joke only he found amusing. "Try not to let the language barrier kill anyone." The wounded arrived 20 minutes later, carried on stretchers by American guards and German orderlies. Isaiah had positioned himself at the first examination table, his instruments laid out in the precise order his training had drilled into him. The first prisoner was young, maybe 19, with a gash across his forehead that bled profusely but looked superficial. The boy was pale, breathing hard, eyes wide with shock. Isaiah moved without hesitation, his hand steady as he began cleaning the wound. "Bleib ruhig," a voice said behind him, speaking German. Ist sie Nita?" Isaiah glanced back to see a man in his 40s, wearing a German uniform with medical insignia, standing near the second examination table. This must be Dr. Schmidt. The German physician was rail-thin, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that held a weariness Isaiah recognized. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much, patched together too many broken bodies, made too many impossible choices. "I don't speak German," Isaiah said, his hand still working on the young soldier's forehead, applying sulfa powder before beginning to stitch. "But I understand you're a doctor." "Doctor." Schmidt stepped closer, watching Isaiah's technique with the critical eye of a professional. "Your English is good," he said in heavily accented words. "I am Johann Schmidt, Schaupsarzt battalion surgeon. Or I was before Normandy." He gestured to the wounded men. "These boys, they work the sawmill, help with the timber harvest. The machinery, it is old, dangerous. The American guards, they push for faster production. This happens." Isaiah finished the suture on the first soldier's forehead, his stitches small and even, exactly as he'd been taught. The young German stared at him with an expression Isaiah couldn't quite read: surprise, confusion, perhaps fear. Isaiah had seen that look before in Tennessee during training, when German posts being transported through town could eat at restaurants that displayed whites-only signs, while Isaiah and his unit ate their meals standing in the rain outside the mess hall designated for colored troops. "Next patient," Isaiah said, moving to the second table where a man in his 30s lay gripping his left arm, his face gray with pain. The arm hung at an unnatural angle below the elbow and blood soaked through a makeshift bandage. Dr. Schmidt examined the arm quickly, his fingers probing with practiced gentleness. "Compound fracture, ulna and radius. The bone, it pierces the skin here." He looked at Isaiah with something close to desperation. "I have no materials for setting this properly. No splints, no plaster. In the Wehrmacht by this time in the war we had nothing. No supplies, no equipment. Men died from wounds that should not kill them. We have supplies," Isaiah said. He called over to Turner, who was treating another patient's lacerations. "James, bring me the splint kit and the plaster rolls from the supply cabinet." As he worked to stabilize the fracture, cleaning the wound site, administering morphine, preparing to set the bones, Isaiah became aware of a change in the atmosphere. The German prisoners who were conscious were watching him with something beyond mere curiosity. Dr. Schmidt stood close, observing every move, occasionally offering comments in German to the injured men, but his eyes never left Isaiah's hands. "You have training," Schmidt said quietly. "Real medical training. Not just the basic first aid of a battlefield orderly. I studied at a nursing college in Georgia before I was drafted," Isaiah said, his focus on aligning the fractured bones. "Wanted to be a physician, but that wasn't an option for a colored man in the South. Settled for what I could get. When the Army needed medics, they took what training we had and built on it. But you are not allowed to treat your own soldiers." Schmidt's confusion was genuine. "This makes no sense. You have the skill, the knowledge." Turner's voice cut in from across the room, bitter and sharp. "Welcome to the United States Army, Doctor, where the Nazis get better medical care than the men in American uniforms, long as those men happen to be the wrong color." The silence that followed held the weight of uncomfortable truth. Isaiah continued working, setting the fracture with careful precision, wrapping the splint, his movements mechanical but certain. The wounded German patient watched him throughout, tears sliding down his face, whether from pain or something else, Isaiah couldn't tell. The worst case came in last. A man in his mid-20s, unconscious, his right hand and forearm crushed beyond recognition, bone fragments visible through torn flesh. Blood loss severe enough that his lips had gone white. Dr. Schmidt took one look, and his shoulders sagged. "He will lose the arm," Schmidt said flatly. "Perhaps die anyway from shock and blood loss. In Normandy, in the Falaise pocket, I saw hundreds like this. We had no morphine, no way to stop the bleeding properly. Men screamed until they could not scream anymore. Then they died. I had to choose who might live and who was beyond help. This man," he gestured to the patient, "3 years ago in Berlin, I could save him. Now?" Isaiah was already moving, checking vitals, starting an intravenous line with practiced efficiency. The plasma they had was American, meant for American casualties. But the captain had authorized its use for the Posay, other of the bitter ironies that Turner could catalog by heart. "We can save him," Isaiah said. "The arm? I don't know. But the man, yes, for the next 3 hours." Isaiah worked with an intensity that blocked out everything except the patient before him. He cleaned the wound, removed shattered bone fragments, tied off severed blood vessels, administered morphine and plasma, made the terrible calculations about what tissue could be salvaged and what had to be removed. Dr. Schmidt assisted, his hands steady despite his obvious exhaustion. translating when the patient briefly regained consciousness, holding instruments, wiping away blood. At some point, Isaiah became aware that other German prisoners had gathered near the hospital windows, watching through the glass. More arrived as word spread through the compound. They stood silent, these men who had fought for Hitler's armies, who had been taught that black people were subhuman, watching a black American medic fight to save one of their own with skill and determination that their own medical services could no longer provide. When Isaiah finally stepped back from the table, the patient's arm was gone from mid-forearm down, but the amputation was clean, the stump properly dressed, the bleeding controlled. The man's pulse was stronger, his breathing more regular. He would live, doctor. Schmidt stared at Isaiah for a long moment, then did something that shocked everyone in the room. He saluted. Not the Nazi salute with its ugly history, but a proper military salute, the kind rendered between fellow soldiers, fellow healers. Tears tracked down his weathered face. "In my country they taught us you were less than human," Schmidt said, his voice breaking. "They taught us lies. So many lies. I see now what I should have seen all along, that you are what I was supposed to be. A doctor who heals because it is right, not because of who the patient is." Isaiah didn't know how to respond. He cleaned his instruments in silence, aware of the eyes on him, the weight of the moment. Through the windows he could see more prisoners gathering, and some of them were weeping openly. Turner stood nearby, his expression a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Sergeant Hayes appeared in the doorway. "Good work, Caldwell. Captain says to finish up and prep for transport back to Fort Sam." "What about follow-up care?" Isaiah asked. "These men need monitoring. The amputation patient needs daily dressing changes, infection watch." "That's not our concern," Hayes said, but his voice lacked its usual edge. Even he had been moved by what he'd witnessed. "We've done our job." As Isaiah gathered his equipment, Dr. Schmidt approached one more time. "I will care for them," he said, "but I must know, how did you learn to do this? How did you become so skilled when your own country treats you this way?" Isaiah thought about his mother, about the colored clinic in Macon where she'd worked for 30 years, treating people who had no other options, making do with donated equipment and determination. He thought about his instructors at the nursing college, men and women who had fought for every scrap of education they'd received, who had passed on their knowledge like precious heirlooms. He thought about the 687th Ambulance Company. Black men who had mastered their trade because they understood that excellence was not just a goal but a survival strategy. "We learned because we had to," Isaiah said simply. "Because if we didn't, our people would have no one to care for them. Because being twice as good gets you half as far, and we made our peace with that a long time ago." The ambulance convoy rolled back through the darkness toward Fort Sam Houston, carrying men who had witnessed something that couldn't be easily explained or understood. Isaiah sat in silence, his medical bag between his knees, staring out at the passing pine forests. He thought about the German prisoners who would sleep tonight because he had kept them alive. He thought about the contradiction of saving the lives of men who had fought for an ideology of hate, while his own country denied him the dignity of eating at a lunch counter or treating a white soldier's wounds. 2 weeks later, Isaiah received orders to report to the Camp Swift Hospital again. Another accident at the sawmill, more wounded prisoners. This time, when he arrived, Dr. Schmidt was waiting outside with a group of German POWs standing at attention. "We have a request," Schmidt said formally. "The men wish to thank you. In our camp we have little to give, but we have carved this." He held out a small wooden box, roughly made but sanded smooth, with a red cross carved into the lid. "For your instruments, so you may carry them with honor." Isaiah took the box, feeling its weight, the rough warmth of the wood. Inside the lid, someone had burned words in careful English. "To the healer who showed us what healing means." Over the following months, until the war's end in the spring of 1945, Isaiah returned to Camp Swift 17 more times. He treated wounds, set bones, fought infections, saved lives. The German prisoners began to call him Herr Doctor, a title that meant nothing to the army but everything to the men who understood what he had done for them. Dr. Schmidt worked beside him, learning new techniques, marveling at the resources. Isaiah had access to resources that had never been available to Wehrmacht medical officers in the war's final years. But the most profound changes happened not in the hospital but in the quiet conversations afterward, when German prisoners who had been taught to see black people as inferior found themselves forced to reconcile propaganda with reality. Some of them had witnessed atrocities, had been part of a regime built on racial supremacy, had believed the lies because believing was easier than questioning. Now they watched as a black American medic did what their own officers could not or would not do. They saw skill where they had been taught to see inadequacy, compassion where they had been taught to see savagery, humanity where they had been taught to see something less. For Isaiah, each return to Camp Swift brought its own kind of pain. He would save German lives in the morning, then return to Fort Sam Houston in the afternoon, where he and his unit were forbidden from entering the officers' club, where they ate in segregated facilities, where they were reminded daily that their service, their skill, their dedication meant nothing in the face of their skin color. He would hear about German POWs being allowed into restaurants in nearby towns while he and his brothers in uniform were turned away. He would watch German prisoners receive mail from home, receive care packages, receive the basic dignities of the Geneva Convention while black soldiers received Jim Crow. One evening in March 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Isaiah sat outside the barracks at Fort Sam Houston, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Turner sat beside him smoking a cigarette, the silence between them comfortable in the way it could only be between men who had seen the same contradictions and survived them. "You think it'll change anything?" Turner asked finally. "What we did out there, what they saw." Isaiah thought about Dr. Schmidt's tears, about the wooden box he kept in his footlocker, about the young German soldier whose life he'd saved, asking, in halting English, why Isaiah had helped them when he had no reason to show mercy. He thought about the letters Schmidt had told him about, letters the prisoners wrote home to Germany, letters that described what they had witnessed, that tried to reconcile Nazi propaganda with the truth of a black American medic's skill and compassion. "I don't know," Isaiah admitted. "Maybe it changes something for them. Maybe some of them go home and remember that the lies they were taught weren't true. Maybe that matters. And what about us?" Turner's voice was quiet, heavy with fatigue. "Does it change anything for us?" Isaiah had no answer for that. In a few months, the war would end. The German prisoners would be sent home to a defeated country, to the hard work of rebuilding from ruins, and Isaiah would return to Georgia, to a South that would see his uniform in his service and still direct him to the colored entrance, still refuse him a seat at the lunch counter, still deny him the opportunities his skill and dedication had earned. But he would also carry with him the memory of Dr. Schmidt's salute, the knowledge that he had been excellent when excellence was demanded, the certainty that he had proven something fundamental about human dignity and capability, even if no one in power was willing to acknowledge it. He would carry the wooden box with its carved red cross, a reminder that healing transcends borders and prejudices, that compassion is stronger than ideology, that in the end, blood is red regardless of whose veins it flows through. The German POWs of Camp Swift would go home with their own memories. They would tell stories about the black American Manette who saved their lives with skill their own medical corps could no longer provide. Some would struggle to reconcile what they had learned with what they had done. Some would deny what they had seen, retreating back into familiar prejudices because admitting the truth meant confronting their complicity in a regime built on lies. But others would carry the memory forward, would tell their children and grandchildren about the moment when a black American soldier showed them the true meaning of the Hippocratic Oath, when compassion proved stronger than conditioning, when humanity won out over hate. Years later, in 1948, President Truman would sign Executive Order 9981, beginning the slow process of desegregating the military. Years after that, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement would challenge the foundations of American segregation. And decades after that, historians would begin documenting the stories of black soldiers in World War II. The men who served a country that didn't fully recognize their humanity, who proved their worth in 1,000 small ways that went unrecorded and unremembered. But in the spring of 1945, Isaiah Caldwell was simply a medic doing his duty, carrying his wooden box with its carved red cross, saving lives because that was what he had been trained to do. Because his mother had taught him that healing was holy work. Because he understood that excellence in the face of injustice was its own form of resistance. The last time Isaiah returned to Camp Swift was in April 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. The camp was buzzing with rumors of the war's end. German prisoners talking in hushed tones about what awaited them at home. Dr. Schmidt met Isaiah at the hospital entrance, his uniform hanging loose on his thinning frame, his eyes bright with emotion. "The war is ending," Schmidt said. "We will go home soon, to a Germany that does not exist anymore, to cities that are rubble, to a defeat we perhaps deserve." He paused, struggling with the words. "I want you to know something. What you did here, what you showed us, it was not lost. I am keeping a journal. Many of us are. We are writing down what we learned, what we saw. We are writing about you." "I'm just one man," Isaiah said. "One medic." "No," Schmidt insisted. "You are proof. Proof that everything we were taught was a lie. Proof that humanity survives even in the face of inhumanity. Proof that healing is possible even when everything else is broken." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Isaiah took it. "Thank you for showing us what we could not see. Thank you for saving our lives when you had every reason to let us die. Thank you for being better than we deserved." Isaiah Caldwell returned to Georgia in the autumn of 1945, his medical bag worn from use, his uniform decorated with commendations that meant nothing to the bus driver who directed him to the colored section. He would work as a medical technician at a veterans hospital, treating black servicemen with the same skill he had used on German prisoners of war. He would marry, raise children, tell his family stories about the war that left out the worst parts and emphasized the small victories. He would keep the wooden box with its carved red cross on his dresser, a reminder of what he had done and who he had been when the world demanded excellence, and he had delivered it. The German prisoners of Camp Swift scattered to the winds of a defeated Germany. Some would rebuild, some would struggle, some would carry the scars of war in ways that never healed. But among them, in letters and journals and whispered memories, the story of the black American medic would persist. It would be a story about the day their prejudices collided with reality, about the moment they understood that hate was a choice and healing was universal, about the time they were saved by the very humanity they had been taught to deny. In that small, strange moment, Isaiah Caldwell, a black medic, barred from treating white soldiers, fed in segregated mess halls. Sleeping in colored barracks became proof of what segregationists and Nazis never grasped, that worth isn't defined by skin color, that skill and compassion cross all barriers, and that in the end we are simply human beings trying to survive with dignity. The German POWs broke down not because they were weak, but because they finally understood what strength really meant. They broke down because they saw a man who had every reason to hate them choose healing instead. They broke down because in that moment their carefully constructed worldview crumbled in the face of simple, stubborn human decency. Isaiah Caldwell never asked for glory, only the chance to use the skills he was trained for. He became a quiet hero, healing because it was in his nature, saving lives because every life mattered. He carried himself with dignity in a world that denied him his due, proving that true worth comes not from skin color, but from character, courage, and compassion. The pine forests of East Texas still stand, and the site of Camp Swift is now a training facility for the Texas National Guard. The barracks where German prisoners once lived are long gone, replaced by modern structures and obstacle courses. But the stories remain, passed down through families, recorded in fading letters and journals, preserved in the memories of a generation that witnessed both the worst and the best of what humanity could be. And somewhere, in a drawer or attic or museum archive, there might still be a wooden box with a carved red cross, a simple testimony to a complicated truth, that in a world divided by race and nation and ideology, a black American medic named Isaiah Caldwell saved German lives with skill their own officers could not provide, and in doing so, saved something more precious than flesh and bone. He saved the possibility of understanding, the hope of reconciliation, the knowledge that even in the darkest times, human beings can choose to be better than their circumstances demand. That was the real victory, won not on battlefields but in hospital wards, not with weapons but with bandages and skill and the stubborn refusal to let hate determine the limits of compassion. It was a victory that went largely unrecorded, unrewarded, unremembered by the official histories, but it was real nonetheless, as real as the lives saved, as enduring as the memory of a German battalion surgeon's tears, as true as the moment when men who thought they knew the truth about human worth learned they had been believing lies their whole lives. Isaiah Caldwell died in 1987 at the age of 67 in a veterans hospital in Atlanta. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his work as a medical technician, his dedication to his community. It did not mention Camp Swift or Dr. Schmidt or the wooden box with the carved red cross. Those stories died with him, known only to his family and a few surviving members of the 687th Ambulance Company. But the truth of what he did, the profound simplicity of his choice to heal rather than hate, to excel despite injustice, to prove through action what words could never convey, that truth remains. It remains in the historical record of black servicemen who served with distinction despite facing discrimination. It remains in the documented fact that German POWs in the United States received better treatment than black American soldiers. It remains in the contradiction that was America in 1944, a nation fighting fascism abroad while practicing segregation at home, a military saving the world from tyranny while denying basic dignity to its own black troops. And it remains in the memory of those German prisoners who learned in a hospital ward in Texas that the enemy of their ideology was not another ideology but simple human truth, that we are all, in the end, just people, capable of healing or harming, of building up or tearing down, of choosing compassion or cruelty. Isaiah Caldwell chose compassion, he chose healing, he chose excellence. And in doing so, he became a quiet revolutionary, a man who changed hearts and minds not through speeches or manifestos, but through the simple act of doing his job with skill and dignity and grace. That is the story of how German POWs broke down when a black American medic saved lives their own officers never could. It is a story about the power of competence in the face of prejudice, about the triumph of humanity over ideology, about one man's refusal to let the limitations others imposed define the limits of what he could do. It is a story that should have been told louder and earlier, that should be remembered and honored, that should stand as a testament to all those who served with distinction despite being denied the recognition they deserved. It is a story about healing in a broken world, and it is true in all the ways that matter most.